Welcome to Gospel Centered Marriage After Dark. We're talking about sex.
Are you
This is
joking?
going to be good. No, I'm
Okay.
not joking. We're doing that. We're doing it. It's so easy to have a wrong perspective when it comes to sex, right?
It is.
So let's spend some time recalibrating our views around what to expect of our experience, of our spouse, of our sex life as a married couple. Does that sound all right?
I
I guess.
I think the real question is why are we having more frustrating experiences than not? And we boiled it down to sex can be frustrating for any marriage. I think there's seasons and times that we go through that. But the one thing that we've found, I guess, is kind of the source or one of the main sources of why it can be frustrating is because usually we don't have a very healthy perspective about it. We
Right.
either take on whatever we might know, we gather pieces of information, whatever culture's saying, like, okay, yeah, this is what sex should be, and this is what I should expect, and it's just kind of all about me. But how does that line up with like the biblical worldview and the perspective there?
Yeah, so we're going to be looking at Proverbs. And Proverbs 5 specifically, it talks about don't let your cistern basically be contaminated. And the cistern being kind of the well from which your sex experience, your sex life comes from. So what are some ways? Let's just talk through that. Because the ideal is that the water is pure, the cistern is untainted, it's unadulterated, right? And it's pure, it's a pure, good married sexual experience. The problem is it's not. That's usually not the case.
Right.
So how do the poisons, how do those toxins work their way in? I think our perspective, like you said, but namely, like what poisons our perspective?
Oftentimes, past experiences, potentially. I mean, it's more common nowadays, I think, for marriages to come together and there's a lot of baggage to deal with sexually.
Yeah.
And so, past experiences, past expectations, brokenness, how do we reconcile and how do we create what God has intended marriage to be in our own marriage?
So you're saying that our past experience will oftentimes lead to fears, frustrations, our past failures even can lead us to feel shame or inadequacy in this area. We can also our frustrations within our marriage, I'll just speak really candidly, like some of the times we've had to rebuild trust kind of over and over again because we'll have a good emotional intimacy happening and it won't lead to fulfillment on the sexual side of things. And so I start to feel like...
Good talk. Good night.
So I'll start to feel like, like basically your needs are being met, but mine are being neglected. And then we'll have a fight or something, and then you'll come on stronger. And I'm like, you're just trying to, I don't trust that. And so we've had to work through those frustrations because it starts to feel like our expectations are off and our understanding and our perspective of sex is skewed in that case.
Speaking of past experiences, I think the biggest one for us was we grew up in kind of the purity culture era where sex is bad and like stay pure until you're married, which is all good and true and fine. But I think we were only left with, hey, like, don't do it before marriage, but it's really great once you get to marriage. And we're like, what is great about it? Like,
what
it's
does
just
great
gonna
mean?
feel good, so why should I wait, really? Like, there wasn't this blown out perspective of there's this whole purpose behind sex in marriage of fruitfulness, right? And unity and...
We can't have a right perspective of sex until we understand the right purposes.
Right.
Of
so
it.
I kind of brought that in, I think, to our marriage, maybe more heavily of like, oh, maybe it's kind of gross, or it's like bad. We don't really talk about it, or it's just it is what it is, and we just do it. Like that's what it is. And so
the purity culture being like you said, I want to tease that out a little bit because I think a lot of folks deal with that. Growing up in the generation that we are.
Something's supposed to be beautiful and good, but you're like, how?
But no one's taught you why, or how.
Right, and the deeper purposes of it.
Right. Yeah, so our hope, I think, for this talk is to really nail down what a biblical perspective of sex is so that you can have that foundation and then you can start actually living in it as a married couple, because every married couple has a sex life that's unique to them. That's the beauty of it. Right? It's a very specific sign to a very specific covenant that you share between you and your spouse. But until you have that foundation, those right expectations, those right perspectives, you kind of find that you
It's
drift.
Just, yeah, it's hard
Yeah.
to have those conversations and start
Yeah.
working through that. So
Yeah, yeah. So let's start by diving into Scripture. I think the one passage that I feel like really gets into this, we mentioned at the beginning, is Proverbs 5. Let's read Proverbs 5. Let's see, what verses are they?
15 through 19, it says, "Drink water from your own cistern, flowing water from your own well. Should your springs be scattered abroad, streams of water in the streets, let them be for yourself alone, and not for strangers with you. Let your fountain be blessed, and rejoice in the wife of your youth, a lovely deer, a graceful doe. Let her breast fill you at all times with delight. Be intoxicated always in her love."
So this is part of Proverbs 5. The heading to this proverb is warnings against adultery. So the first few verses are all about, hey, son, it's a father talking to his son, avoid this, like adulterous women, or I guess, what's the word they use? They talk about wayward women or forbidden women, right? And then it goes down further into this passage,
Right.
which is avoid that, but go for this. And so I think that's a really good starting point for our view of sex, is that it's inherently good. Like we mentioned earlier.
Right. It's not gross. It's not something that should keep us apart, but actually bring us together.
So having that context for Proverbs, I think we get the very first key, which is absolutely foundational, is that sex in itself is created good. Right? God wasn't somehow just like wincing, looking away, saying, this is a necessary, gross thing. Like
Right.
God created it for his glory, for our good, and even for our pleasure, right? Right? And so I think purity culture is what kind of,
Well, the idea sort of stopped before that of just,
Right.
it is good. It's great. That's it.
right?
Better wait.
Right. So
So then when we actually stepped into marriage and had sex, it was, your expectations might have been so big and so great, and then it's like, oh, it's kind of a letdown. But if you're only thinking about the act itself and not understanding, again, the greater purposes that God designed for your sex life, then I think that was something we had to grow in, because it was like, well, is this what we do every time we do it? Like, I guess
Yeah.
this is just, it felt very functional and not so emotionally unifying, and there's whole, the spiritual aspect of it. And yes, of course,
Right.
procreation is huge, but again, I don't think that's something you just naturally step into, because we have this sin has tainted sex for us.
I think this mischaracterization of sex even went further back than even just purity culture,
Right.
all the way back into the Hellenistic Greek philosophies that basically said that anything that's physical is inherently bad, and anything
Right.
that's spiritual is inherently good. Well, that's not helpful,
Right.
And it's not biblical.
Right.
Right? We don't see that in the Bible. We actually see the opposite. We see that sex is good. It is, and it's very physical. I mean, just read Song of Songs, Song of Solomon. It's an amazing book. It's pretty graphic. And why did God include that in the Bible? Why did he give that to us? And it wasn't so that we could hide from it and avoid it. It was so that we could press into it in a way that is good, the way it was intended to be good. And that's within the confines of marriage, within the confines of mutual trust, mutual intimacy.
Right.
That whole perspective is just so liberating to
Right.
see it that way.
Yeah, and it's
Yeah.
extremely foundational. I think moving into the second key perspective on sex is that we have to mindfully engage in it.
Yeah. Drinking.
What we mean by that?
Yeah,
right?
what do we mean by that?
So,
So in the proverb, it says, drink water from your own cistern, flowing water from your own well. That act of drinking is not just it's important, right? When you drink something, you are internalizing it. You are engaging with it. And the cistern in Near Eastern culture was where the
drinking water.
drinking water
yeah.
was held, and it was to be kept pure, and it was to be kept exclusive. That's another piece to this we'll talk about a little bit later. But internalizing it and drinking it, not just seeing it as something to be endured, but
Yeah.
something to be engaged in. And so what do we mean by that? Like,
Well, for us, I think that's really, I've had to grow in that area of learning to, okay, we're going to set, our frequency. We're talking about that every couple days. We know that we get tired at night, but that's not a reason for me to not be able to engage, or for you to not be able to say, hey, I'm still going to enjoy this. I'm going to engage with my wife. I'm going to love, we're going to love each other through this.
Yeah.
And I think it's just part of that is just sacrificial as well. Just giving of yourself in a sacrificial and joyful way and serving one another in those areas.
I think as husbands, that's one of the biggest ways that we can be mindfully engaged in the act of sex. Is you're not just thinking of yourself and your own desires and what you want to get from your wife or from the experience, but you're saying, how can I serve her in this exchange? Instead of just harvesting from her the pleasure that I want, how can I give her pleasure? Not just sexual pleasure, but how can I serve her? Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And emotionally,
Right.
and slowing things down and talking and connecting and asking questions. What do you need? How can I
Right.
love you? How can I love you well through this? I appreciate you. I know that this is more physical for me than it might be for you. Sometimes that's the case. Thank you, but just know that I love you in
Right.
this, right? And so that's mindful engagement. That's being, I think, a mindful steward of that cistern,
Right.
and knowing that it's a gift that for refreshment, for partaking, for internalizing, for engaging in. So
Right.
actually leads to the third key, and I love this one, and it's so obvious but so missed nowadays, is that sex is radically exclusive.
Right. He talked about that with the cistern of
Yes.
how it is just between you and your spouse.
Yes.
It's within this marriage covenant, and it was created for that.
Yeah, and that's what Proverbs 5:16 says, is should your springs be scattered abroad, streams of water in the streets. Okay, so the first half of this proverb is saying, son, be careful, don't commit adultery, don't follow this path. Instead, stay on the path of wisdom. Now, imagine if your well was contaminated, if your cistern was scattered into the streets,
Right.
right? So it's radically exclusive in that way.
Right. And I think one of the modern twists that we have to deal with, and many couples have brought this question to us, like, is it okay to bring porn into the bedroom? Is it
Yeah.
add more sizzle to your sex life,
Right.
kind of thing? And the answer that is without hesitation is absolutely not. No, it's never okay to bring anything inside the bedroom that might objectify or hurt or break down that covenant, that purity of the cistern.
Yeah, we've said this before, but sex is the sign, right, of the substance of the covenant of marriage. And that's why it's so exclusive.
What do you mean by that? The sign of the substance.
Well, the substance of the covenant is that we are committed to each other. We are one flesh, that we are in unity, that we are serving each other and loving each other selflessly. And sex is the sign of that. And that's why sex is so, it's so just magnificent. It's so powerful. It's also something to be wielded very carefully. And it's so easy to have our that exclusivity, that sign, contaminated by, like you said, by pornography. Either whether it's some couples ask, like you said, if they can bring it in. That's a hard no. A lot of guys struggle with it. They know it's wrong, but they still struggle with it. But they're still bringing that in what they're expecting their wife to do or how they're expecting their wife to act. And so that is absolutely key to changing our view of sex, is to realize that it's radically exclusive, that it's not just about avoiding lust. That's important, but it's about maintaining the exclusivity of your sexual life, your sexual, that part of you as an individual is only for your spouse. It's not to be,
And that is all to the glory of God.
yes,
Us engaging in that exclusively brings God glory, it's the sign of the substance of our covenant.
yeah. And so beautiful. So the fourth one, which I think is obviously a great progression,
Yes.
is that it's rooted in friendship.
Yeah.
Okay, so if this covenant's just between me and you, our sexual experience is an overflow of a deeper intimacy. Believe it or not, the deeper intimacy of our friendship, of our spiritual
Which
connection.
sounds kind of
Yeah.
funny, but it's so true. I think like the fact that we are best friends, it sounds so high school, but you are my closest friend. You're my
absolutely, yeah.
confidant. I want to share everything with you. And the fact that we have that friendship, this sex should solidify that, but also help us grow in that.
Yeah, and the friendship is what keeps us from objectifying each other, right? When I see you as another human soul, as my sister in Christ, as a daughter of the King,
Remembering we're a person.
yeah, you're a
Yes.
person. You're with thoughts and with emotions and with when we
Feelings.
laugh together and feelings. Right? You're not just an object, right? And so it's rooted in that deep friendship. And this is why we found it so important to remind couples to be very careful about friendships of the opposite sex, right? Because it's very easy if we have a bad week or whatever, and if you start confiding with someone of the opposite sex at work or at church or on social media or wherever, you say, oh, they're just a friend. They're just a friend.
It's
Like,
harmless.
right. It's not, because that friendship is a deep well. It's a deep, it's like that's where intimacy comes from.
Right.
It's from that friendship. And there are different types of intimacy, but namely sexual intimacy always starts in the friendship
Right.
with the opposite sex.
Right.
And that's reserved for your spouse.
And if you kind of maybe find yourself wandering away, like you said, from your friendship, one thing that's always helped us is to kind of look back at the beginnings of our relationship. Granted, we were young
Right.
little high schoolers, but I think the beginning of anybody's relationship, there's always something to look back at, looking at your spouse and how you thought of them or what you admired about them or what made you laugh about them and how you guys connected. So sometimes going back in your mind and remembering why you loved them and why you wanted to be with them and why you committed yourself to
Yeah.
each other has been one of the biggest ways we reconnect if it's been hard to be friends and get along.
Yeah. And laughter is usually the shortcut
Usually
there.
shortcuts, yes.
And I can't say how many times we've been in a funk and we both knew that like physical intimacy should happen, but neither of us were like being generous toward each other. I was probably frustrated. You were probably frustrated. And we just would watch something that would make us laugh, or we would start joking. We were fighting pretty heavily the other night. I'm just to be honest. We were having a fight, and I started saying something. I couldn't help myself.
Sometimes he starts laughing and I'm not on board yet. So
But I'll like
That's the
quote
bad
something.
part.
Like a lot of our humor has to do with like quoting funny things. And and you were laughing, but I could tell you were frustrated.
I wanted to stay mad.
That actually created a bridge, though,
Yeah.
and it did take some time. And I knew
I
that
guess it did.
because she does that same thing to me, and I get furious because I do not want to laugh. And
You don't want to laugh,
I
but
remember-
it's hard not to laugh, and then you're laughing.
Sorry, I remember one time. Do you remember this? I was making dinner one night. And you were-
One night. Yep. No.
I make dinner
You
a
make
lot.
dinner a lot. That's why I was like, I don't know.
And so I was making dinner, and we were talking through this conflict that we had, and I was like, and I just said like, you're like, what's wrong with you? And it's like, I just don't get no respect.
Like, I'm
And the
getting
way-
no respect.
And it sounded like Rodney Dangerfield being quoted by Michael Scott from The Office. And I immediately just lost it because I
Started
realized that I
laughing really
sounded
hard.
unintentionally
Yes.
like him. Anyway, humor is a shortcut to remembering your friendship, which is kind of is the wellspring
Yeah.
of a healthy biblical sex life. So, all right, so let's go to the fifth one. The fifth key to a healthy perspective on sex is to be enjoyed immensely. I know we've talked about it. We've talked about engaging. We've talked about it's a good thing, but I think it's on a different level. Enjoyment and delighting is something that you just need to be reminded of, that it's on the table. It's good to enjoy and even learn deeper levels
That's
of
what I was
enjoyment.
gonna say. I think
Yeah.
that it's some of it is learned, so kind of taking that pressure off of like, okay, you should enjoy it. Like, keep enjoying it. If you're not enjoying it, something's wrong. Like, I think there's this. It's a journey. It's a journey together of feeling more safe with each other and feeling like we can explore together and we can love each other, in new ways
Yeah.
physically. And so it's the substance that is the sign of the covenant. We're not going anywhere. We're going to engage in this immensely. We're going to learn how to enjoy it and understand the deeper purposes that God has ordained for it.
I just love the language in this proverb. That starts in verse 18. Let your fountain be blessed and rejoice. Pause. Rejoice. Rejoice in the wife of your youth, a lovely deer, a graceful doe. That's Near Eastern language. Like, it sounds a little off here, but trust me, that's pretty cool stuff. It says, let her breasts fill you at all times with delight. And then this one gets me, be intoxicated always in her love. There's nowhere else in the Bible where intoxication is okay. Like, truly. Usually intoxication is always a bad thing, right? Because you lose your sense of awareness, your sense of inhibition, your sense of wisdom.
Capability,
Yeah, it all goes out the door. But here, that's okay, right? So enjoying pressing into this rapturous thing that is love in terms of your sexual intimacy. That's an amazing hall pass. Like, God is saying, like, have at it, have fun.
Yeah.
Like, read Song of Solomon. That's what it
Right.
is. It's these two lovers are just engaging and enjoying each other, and there's virtually no boundaries there. One thing that I'm thinking about here is a lot of couples will come to us and say, how can we be more adventurous, right? They feel like maybe their sex life is getting monotonous or it's boring. So what are some ways that couples can find a way path through that, maybe into a more of an enjoyment in a new way.
So now ask me how to be adventurous.
Well, I don't know. I'm just, yeah, I mean, I think talking about it.
Well, yeah, of course. That's what we're talking about. I thought you were like, here's some ideas of how to be more adventurous.
No, like we're not going to tell you that. Like that's for you to figure out. That's what we're talking about.
God.
But the point is some couples think like this is it. This is all it's going to be.
Right. Well,
Like,
I think we limit our conversation to talk about, okay, how do we make it more adventurous? Like we were just sitting here and like laughing about that, but really it begins outside the bedroom, and that's, I think, one of the biggest keys here is just our connection, our intimacy, our closeness, our safety really happens again through our friendship, outside the bedroom, laughing together, finding pathways back to each other if we are having some distance,
yeah.
and getting people involved if we are feeling very disconnected and alone, and it's kind of that
I mean, having other guide couples speak into this area.
yes, and people and friends that care about us and that know us and can help guide us, like hold our hands and bring us back to each other.
So this fifth key is really where we want to leave this video to give you a place to jump off of for the next one.
Right.
Because this idea that sex is to be enjoyed immensely and to be engaged in intentionally, like I think people who are watching this, listening to this, they agree that sex is good and it's to be enjoyed exclusively. It's from our friendship. But then the question is, where do we go from here?
Yeah, how do we start those conversations?
Yeah, starting those conversations. So if you're watching this and you're wondering where to go from here, the next video is to give you a path back to the well. If you maybe feel like you've lost a healthy perspective and it's not, and you need to spend some time reconciling what the Bible says with what your perspective is, you have to get your foot set on a steady path.
Right.
And the next video is just that.